A hand presses against the rough, sun-baked stone of a doorway. Outside, the street is thick with the noise of the ancient Near East. It is known as the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. The Lord is one. To bind the words to your forehead was to filter everything you looked at through the reality of God's undivided nature. This is not an isolated metaphor. The connection between the hand and the forehead is so critical to biblical theology that it returns centuries later in the final book of the Bible. In the book of Revelation, the Apostle John describes an empire that forces the inhabitants of the earth to receive a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. For generations, modern readers have tried to decode this as a prediction of microchips or barcodes. But John was a Jewish writer steeped in the Torah. He was drawing an image directly from Deuteronomy 6. The mark of the beast is an ant. It is a symbol of economic and mental allegiance given to a corrupt system instead of the one true God. The biblical pattern is uncompromising. Your allegiance is always marked by what you do with your hands and what you give your attention to with your eyes. God does not just want the invisible, abstract soul. He wants your physical movements, your daily labor, and your moment-to-moment focus. The body itself must become a memorial of the covenant. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Yet, capturing the individual body was only the first phase of the plan. Individual devotion is fragile, and individual bodies eventually die. If the Shema was going to survive the centuries, it had to conquer a much larger territory. The allegiance had to move outward from the individual's skin, weaving itself directly into the physical architecture of their world. The human body is temporary. A single generation bound to the Shema could conquer Canaan. But what happens 50 years later when that generation is gone? Moses understood that the covenant could not survive on individual devotion alone. It needed an institution. But the institution he selected to preserve the faith was not the priesthood. And it was not the tabernacle. It was the family dining table. Moses pushes the Shema past the boundaries of the individual body and embeds it directly into the daily rhythms of the household. He commands, "You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise." Look at the absolute totality of this sequence: sitting and walking, lying down and rising up. It covers the two fundamental dimensions of human existence, space and time. Whether you are stationary or in motion, whether it is the quiet darkness of the evening or the chaotic light of the morning, the covenant must be spoken. Notice what is missing from this list. For thousands of years, Jewish people have recited these words morning and night. Jesus of Nazareth called them the absolute center of the universe. Moses does not say, "Talk of them when you attend a religious festival," or "Speak of them when you offer a sacrifice." Faith was never meant to be confined to a sacred building. It was designed to be forged in the mundane transitions of an ordinary day. The Hebrew word used for "teach them diligently" is shanan. It does not mean to give a polite, academic lecture. Its root meaning is to whet or sharpen, like a man scraping a blade against a stone until it holds a lethal edge. Moses is telling parents to sharpen their children with these words, repeating them relentlessly until the covenant becomes their default instinct. But the architecture of memory requires one final, physical anchor. Moses says, "You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." In Jewish tradition, this command is fulfilled by affixing a mezuzah, a small case containing the Shema, to the right side of the doorframe. Every time a person enters or leaves the house, they physically touch the words. In the ancient world, a doorpost was not just a piece of wood. It was a threshold. It marked the boundary between the safe, ordered interior of the family and the dangerous, unpredictable exterior of the street. By placing the words of the Shema on the doorpost, the home is explicitly claimed as covenant territory. When an Israelite crossed the threshold to go to work in a world of competing gods, they touched the Shema to remember who they served. When they returned at night, exhausted by the noise of the culture. They touched it again to leave. If you have spent any time in a church or a synagogue, you have likely heard them. But familiarity has a dangerous side effect: the chaos outside. The doorpost stood as an unmoving sentinel, declaring that everything inside this house belonged entirely to the God of Israel. The architecture of memory was brilliant. It captured the intellect, the life, the resources, the body, the daily schedule, the children, and the physical walls of the house. It was a perfect, inescapable system of covenant defense. But centuries later, the system collapsed. The defense mechanism failed because of a tragic, unavoidable flaw in human nature. Physical reminders can only preserve a covenant if the people actually care about what the symbols mean. By the time of the biblical prophets, the system had become a hollow shell. The words were still strapped to their hands and nailed to their doors, but they had vanished from the people living inside. And when the Shema leaves the heart, the exile is never far behind. The most dangerous thing about a religious symbol is that it can survive long after the devotion that created it has died. Centuries after Moses gave his final speech in the wilderness, the Israelites were fully settled in the Promised Land. The architecture of memory was operating exactly as designed. The leather boxes were strapped securely to foreheads. The parchment was nailed to the wooden doorposts of their stone houses. The Shema was recited every morning when the sun rose, and every evening when the sun set. It causes us to stop paying attention. Most people today read the Shema simply as a foundational creed, but beneath the flawless repetition of the liturgy, a fatal rot had set in. When we read the biblical prophets, men like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, we are reading the autopsy of a deaf nation. The prophets looked at the daily life of Israel and pointed out a terrifying contradiction. The people were reciting the prayer, but their lev, their intellect, and will was given over to corrupt political alliances. Their hands were bound with phylacteries. But those same hands were cheating the poor and shedding innocent blood. Their eyes were supposedly dedicated to God, but they were looking to the idols of Canaan for security. They were giving their mayod, their wealth, energy, and strength, to everything except the God who rescued them. They had mastered the acoustic sound of the Shema, but they had completely failed to Shema. They were listening, but they were not doing. The physical defense system proved powerless against internal corruption. A piece of parchment on a wooden frame can decorate a house, but it cannot cure a human heart. Because the covenant was broken, the protective boundary was finally removed. The consequence was the Babylonian exile. Foreign empires swept into the land, burned the houses, tore down the doorposts, destroyed the temple, and dragged the people away in chains. We assume it is a theological declaration that there is only one God, followed by a general command to try very hard to love Him with our emotions. The ancient architecture was reduced to ash. But in the middle of this devastation, the prophet Jeremiah delivered a stunning promise. He realized that the problem was not the words of the Shema. The problem was the surface on which the words had been written. For generations, the law had been written on stone tablets, animal parchment, and doorposts. It was entirely external, speaking for God. Jeremiah announced a new covenant. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts. The prophet Ezekiel echoed this promise, declaring that God would remove their heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh. The physical symbols were always meant to point forward. The ultimate goal of the covenant was an internal takeover. The Shema was destined to move from the exterior doorpost directly into the human chest. For centuries after the exile, the people waited. They returned to the land. They rebuilt their houses. They kept reciting the words. But they waited in the silence for a human heart capable of actually fulfilling the ancient demand. Then, in the 1st century, the silence is broken in a crowded temple courtyard. A group of religious scholars corners a young rabbi from Nazareth. They bring him a highly debated, dangerous question designed to trap him. We treat it as an intellectual belief, a religious fact to be memorized and repeated during a worship service. They ask him to sift through the hundreds of commands in the Torah and identify the absolute center of the universe. Which commandment is the most important of all? To answer this question, Jesus reaches past the prophets, past the rubble of the exile, and past the temple. He points directly back to the dust of the wilderness and the threshold of Deuteronomy. He recites the Shema, but what he does next changes the definition of covenant love forever. The stone courtyard of the temple in Jerusalem was a place of constant theological combat. When the scribe approached Jesus in Mark chapter 12, the atmosphere was tense. The religious leaders had been trying to catch him in a trap all day. The scribe asks, which commandment is the most important of all? In the first century, this was a massive debate. With over 600 individual laws in the Torah, which one was the foundation? Jesus answers by reciting the exact words every Jewish man, woman, and child had spoken that very morning. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. If Jesus had stopped speaking there, every religious leader in the courtyard would have nodded in agreement. The problem is not that this familiar interpretation is wrong. The problem is that it is fundamentally incomplete. It was the perfect, unassailable orthodox answer. But Jesus does not stop. He reaches deep into the scroll of Leviticus, pulls out an entirely different law, and welds it permanently to the Shema. The second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. Notice his grammar. He quotes two distinct passages from two different books, but he concludes by saying there is no other commandment, singular, greater than these. He has taken the ultimate demand for divine allegiance and fused it completely with human compassion. By attaching Leviticus 19 to Deuteronomy 6, Jesus solved the greatest practical problem of the Shema. The problem is this: how does a human being actually give their mayod, their physical resources, their money, and their strength to an invisible God? The pagan nations around ancient Israel gave their wealth to their gods by placing food and gold at the feet of wooden statues. But the God of Israel has no physical statue. He does not eat human crops, and he cannot be bought with human gold. Jesus reveals that the invisible God has already placed his image into the physical world. That image is the human being standing right in front of you. You cannot claim to love God with all your lev, your intellect, while using your mind to manipulate others. You cannot claim to love God with your nefesh, your physical life, while crushing the life out of the vulnerable. The Shema is not actually a declaration of intellectual belief. It is not asking for your mental agreement. And you cannot claim to love God with your mayod, your wealth and capacity, while refusing to use that capacity to feed your starving neighbor. The two commands are fundamentally one. The invisible God is loved through the visible neighbor. To walk past a person bleeding on the side of the road is to fail the Shema entirely. The scribe standing before Jesus hears this answer and is stunned. He realizes this rabbi has correctly diagnosed the architecture of the entire biblical story. He replies, "You are right, teacher. To love him with all the heart, and to love one's neighbor as oneself, is much more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. The external rituals of the temple mean absolutely nothing if the internal allegiance is fractured. It is a beautiful teaching. It resets the moral compass of the world. But Jesus did not come merely to deliver a brilliant theological lecture. A teacher can explain the Shema perfectly, but a lecture cannot fix the broken human condition. Jesus came to do something no other human had ever accomplished. The ultimate meaning of this ancient prayer is only revealed when we leave the temple courtyard and look at how the rabbi's life ended. For 3 years, Jesus did not merely teach the Shema. He became the living, breathing embodiment of it. It is a physical, spatial, and generational blueprint. When Moses stood before the Israelites on the plains of Moab, he was not giving them a theology lesson. For centuries, Israel had recited the words morning and evening while their hearts wandered. They bound the leather straps to their arms, while their hands built idols. They nailed the parchment to their doorposts, while their homes harbored injustice. The external symbols had become a convenient mask for a deeply divided allegiance. But when we read the Gospels, we are watching the ancient prayer finally become flesh. Look at Jesus' lev, his intellect, and his will. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when faced with the terrifying, agonizing reality of the cross, he did not search for an escape route. He surrendered his will entirely to the Father, praying, "Not my will, but yours be done." That is the absolute fulfillment of the lev. Look at his mayod, his strength and his capacity. He did not hoard his power to build a political empire or secure personal comfort. He spent every ounce of his muchness touching the unclean, feeding the hungry, and restoring the broken. He gave his absolute strength to the Father by pouring it out completely on his neighbor. But the ultimate test of the Shema has always been the nephesh. Remember the physical reality of that ancient word. The nephesh is the throat. It is the breath. It is life itself. To love God with all your nephesh means that your loyalty to the Father matters more than your own biological survival. The air smells of burning incense, animal fat, and the sweat of merchants bartering under the heavy heat. He was giving them a survival mechanism against spiritual amnesia. He knew that the moment they crossed the Jordan River and walked into the land of Canaan, on a Friday afternoon outside the city walls of Jerusalem, the Shema reached its devastating and beautiful climax. Jesus of Nazareth was nailed to a wooden beam. In the ancient world, the words of the covenant were attached to the wooden frame of the doorpost to mark the boundary of God's house. On the cross, Jesus himself became the doorpost. His torn body became the ultimate threshold through which a fractured humanity could finally return home to the Father. The Romans drove iron nails through his hands. They pressed a crown of thorns into his forehead, the very places where the law commanded the Israelites to bind the words of the covenant. The hand and the space above the eyes were pierced and bloodied. And, as his nephesh failed, as his breath became shallow, his lungs collapsed, and his throat went dry, he did not curse God. He did not divide his loyalty. With his final, agonizing breath, he offered his nephesh entirely to the Father. He was the first and only human being to perfectly Shema. He heard, and he acted, all the way into the dark. This is the central contrast of the biblical story. The gospel is not a heavy motivational speech telling you to try harder to fulfill the Shema. If the command were left entirely up to human willpower, the noise of the surrounding culture would overwhelm them. They would be surrounded by people who believed that security came from dividing your allegiance among many gods. We would all fail today. Just as the generation in the wilderness failed, the gospel is the astonishing news that Jesus is the true Israelite. He lived the life of undivided loyalty that we could not live. And he died the death that our divided loyalty deserved. And because he rose from the grave, the ancient prophetic promise of Jeremiah and Ezekiel has finally been triggered. Jesus does not just hand us another leather box to bind to our hands. He does not ask us to carve the law into stone. Through his Spirit, he takes the words off the external doorpost and begins writing them directly onto the living tissue of the human heart. He gives us the power to finally begin to hear. And this is where the ancient prayer leaves the first century and arrives at your own front door. The noise of the ancient gods has changed its volume, but not its nature. 3,000 years ago, a man stood at the threshold of a stone house, his hand pressed against a wooden frame, while the noise of competing gods raged in the street behind him. He touched the parchment on the doorpost to remind himself of his absolute allegiance before stepping out into the chaos. Today, the architecture of the house has changed, but the noise has not. If you need rain, you pray to Baal. If you need a child, you pray to Asherah. The ancient world was built on fragmented loyalty. The ancient gods of Canaan have simply updated their methods. We are surrounded by a culture designed to divide our loyalty, fracture our attention, and capture our mayad, our energy, our money, and our strength. The noise is digital. The anxiety is relentless, and the demand for our allegiance is constant. The world is still trying to tear our devotion into pieces. And you stand at the threshold of your own life. Step back and look at the magnificent, all-consuming architecture of this ancient command. It was never just a theological poem. It was a battle plan. And when we trace it from the dust of the wilderness to the blood of the cross, it compresses down into three undeniable realities. First, it reveals that true hearing leaves a physical mark. In the biblical world, listening and obeying are the exact same action. If your faith is only a private, intellectual agreement that does not change how you use your hands, how you spend your money, or where you direct your eyes, you have not yet heard the voice of God. Second, it reveals that the invisible God is loved in the physical world. Your absolute devotion to the Creator is measured by your practical compassion for the neighbor standing right in front of you. Third, it reveals that the kingdom of God is forged in the ordinary routines of an average week. The primary classroom of faith is not a sanctuary. To survive in that world, Israel needed an architecture of allegiance that was stronger than the culture around them. On a Sunday morning, it is your living room. It is the conversation in the car. Look at your own daily rhythms. When you sit in your house, when you walk to your work, when you lie down in the dark, and when you wake up to the demands of a new morning, what is capturing your attention? What you listen to determines what you love, and what you love determines who you become. This is not ultimately a story about reciting a prayer. It is a story about allowing a unified God to completely integrate your fractured life. The doorpost of your house is no longer just a piece of wood. It is the boundary of your attention. Every time you cross the threshold into the chaos of the week, or return home exhausted from the demands of the culture, you are making a decision. You are deciding who owns your intellect, your survival, and your strength. You are choosing what to Shema. The demand is absolute. And on your own, your willpower will eventually fail. But you are no longer standing in the wilderness, relying on a leather box to protect your memory. The rabbi who perfectly fulfilled the Shema has already walked through the door. He gave his entire life to prove his love. And through his Spirit, he has written the covenant directly into the living tissue of your chest. You do not have to generate this allegiance through fear. They needed a reality that could take over their physical spaces, their daily routines, and their family structures. You only have to respond to the one who loved you first. The noise of the world is deafening, but it does not own you. Listen, this is not ultimately a story about reciting a prayer. It is a story about where we place our absolute allegiance in a world of competing voices. It is about how a single command can capture the human body, the home, and the generations that follow. But before we can see the architecture of this prayer, we have to confront a massive linguistic problem. The entire defense system begins with a single Hebrew word, and the English translation of that word hides a contradiction that completely changes what God is actually asking us to do. The English translation begins with a simple, familiar word, hear. In the modern Western world, hearing is a biological reflex. If you listen closely, you can hear the chants of local priests offering sacrifices to the gods of weather, fertility, and war. It is acoustic reception. Sound waves travel across a room, enter the ear canal, and strike the eardrum. You can sit perfectly still, listen to an emergency siren, and do absolutely nothing in response. We divide the human experience. We separate the intake of information from the physical action that follows. But the ancient audience standing in the dust of the wilderness did not think that way. The Hebrew word that opens the prayer is Shema. It is an imperative command, and it is where the entire prayer gets its name. The English translation is accurate, but the original term carries an additional, muscular sense that changes the way the verse functions. In biblical Hebrew, listening and responding were never considered two separate events. They were a single, unbroken action. To understand this, we have to recognize a startling linguistic fact. In ancient Hebrew, there is no distinct, separate word for obey. The word for listening and the word for obeying are exactly the same word. When God says in the book of Exodus that he heard the groaning of the Israelite slaves under the whips of Egypt, it does not mean he merely registered the acoustic sound of their weeping. His hearing was his rescue. He heard, and therefore he moved. The physical deliverance proved the hearing. It is a world of endless, chaotic noise. A world where human survival depends on keeping dozens of unpredictable, often violent deities satisfied. The same expectation applies to human beings. If a father asks a child to complete a task, and the child simply stands there, nodding to acknowledge the sound of the words, but doing nothing, the child has not shema'd. The biblical equation is absolute. If you have not acted, you have not actually heard. The problem is not that the opening of the Shema is unclear. The problem is that we listen too passively. When Moses stood before a nation of former slaves, people who had spent their entire lives taking orders from an Egyptian pharaoh, he did not cry out, "Shema, O Israel," just to get their attention. He was not saying, "Please listen closely to this new theology." He was issuing a demand for total mobilization. He was saying, "Listen, pay attention, and align your physical actions with my voice." This demand is immediately anchored to the nature of God himself. Moses continues, "The Lord our God, the Lord is one." The Hebrew word used here is echad. It means unified, entire, and undivided. The logic of the passage is brilliant and uncompromising. Because God is echad, undivided in his authority, the allegiance of his people must also be undivided. You cannot truly Shema the God of Israel while keeping one foot, but the man standing at the threshold ignores the noise. He touches the wooden frame of his doorpost, bows his head, and speaks 6 words. In the polytheistic temples of Canaan, the Shema is not a request for a quiet audience. It is a demand for a singular, active loyalty. But the command does not end with a call for obedience. It immediately crosses a boundary. Moving from the language of duty into the language of devotion, Moses tells the people, "You shall love the Lord your God." For the modern reader, this is where the passage softens. We understand love as an internal feeling, a warm spiritual affection, a burst of emotion during a song. But if hearing actually means doing, then this ancient love must mean something far heavier than human emotion. And when we examine the ancient anatomy of love, the requirements of the covenant suddenly escalate. How do you command a feeling? The problem with reading the word love through a modern lens is that it makes the Shema impossible to obey. You cannot mandate an emotion. You cannot order a human being to feel a sudden, sustained rush of affection. If the command to love the Lord your God is simply a demand for intense emotional warmth, then the Israelites were set up to fail the moment their mood changed. But in the ancient Near East, the word love carried a much heavier weight. Most readers today imagine that the famous prayers of the Bible were composed in quiet, peaceful sanctuaries. In the political treaties of the ancient world, love was a covenantal term. It was the specific word used to describe the absolute, unbending loyalty, a vassal owed to a sovereign king. It was not about how the subject felt on a given Tuesday. It was about whether the subject remained faithful, when the pressure increased, to explain exactly what this loyalty requires. Moses breaks the human being down into 3 distinct parts. He demands their heart, their soul, and their might. But the Hebrew words he uses, lev, nefesh, and mio, do not mean what we think they mean. First, Moses demands the lev. We translate this as heart. Today, we associate the heart with romance and feeling. But in ancient Israel, the lev was the center of intellect. It was where you did your thinking, your reasoning, and your decision-making. To love God with all your lev does not mean to feel warm toward him. It means to surrender your intellect and your will to his authority. Next, Moses demands the nefesh. We translate this as soul. In Western thought, the soul is often viewed as the invisible, ghostly part of a person that floats away after death. But the Hebrew word nephesh is intensely physical. Its root meaning refers to the human throat. It is the literal place where breath enters, where water is swallowed, and where physical life is sustained. By extension, it means your entire bodily existence. We associate them with stained glass, soft lighting, and silence. But the most important prayer in the biblical story was not born in a sanctuary. To love God with all your nephesh is to offer up your very breath. It means your loyalty to God matters more than your own physical preservation. Finally, Moses demands the mayod. Our English Bibles usually translate this as might or strength, which makes us picture physical muscles. But mayod is actually an adverb. It translates literally to very or much. Moses essentially takes an adverb and forces it to behave like a noun. He tells the people to love God with all their muchness. In the ancient world, a person's muchness was their capacity, their wealth, their cattle, their influence, their property, and their energy. Step back and look at the architecture of this command. This is not an invitation to a private spiritual feeling. This is a total takeover of human existence. You are commanded to love God with your intellect and your choices, lev, your physical breath and survival, nephesh, and your money, power, and resources, mayod. The invisible God is loved through the visible deployment of every asset you possess. But this raises a devastating practical question. How does a human being actually sustain this level of total devotion? Human willpower is notoriously weak. The generation standing before Moses had seen the sea split. Yet, they still built a golden calf the moment they felt anxious. Moses knew better than anyone that memory leaks. He knew that the human mind cannot hold on to absolute allegiance without a physical anchor. If the Shema remained an abstract idea, it would evaporate. It was forged in the dirt. It was spoken on the edge of a hostile desert, given to a generation of wandering refugees, the moment the people faced a crisis in Canaan. So, Moses did not just give them words to memorize. He built a defense system to protect the words. He took the invisible covenant and anchored it directly to the human body. The human mind is a terrible container for absolute loyalty. It is easily distracted, quick to forget, and prone to abandoning in the daylight what it fiercely promised in the dark. Moses understood the severe frailty of human memory. He knew the sheer volume of competing noise in Canaan would eventually drown out his voice. If the command to love God with all your intellect, your life, and your resources was left entirely to internal willpower, the covenant would fail before the current generation died out. So Moses introduces a shockingly physical solution. He commands the people, "You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes." For thousands of years, Jewish communities have honored this text through the wearing of tefillin, or phylacteries. These are small, dark leather boxes containing parchment scrolls inscribed with the words of the Shema, who were about to enter a culture designed to divide their loyalty and destroy their memory. That prayer is found in the 6th chapter of Deuteronomy. Using long leather straps, the worshiper binds one box tightly to the inner arm, angling it toward the heart, and wraps the strap down the arm to the fingers. The second box is strapped securely to the forehead, resting just above the eyes. Imagine the sensory experience: the pulling of the leather, the physical pressure of the strap against the skin, the distinct weight of the box on the head. Every morning, the worshiper feels a tactile, bodily interruption. The abstract idea of covenant loyalty is literally strapped to the human frame. But the underlying logic of this command does something even more profound than establishing a religious ritual. We must ask the deeper question: why did God choose these specific body parts? Why the hand and the forehead? In the ancient world, the hand was the primary instrument of human action. It represented your labor, your economics, the way you held your tools, and how you interacted with the physical world. To bind the Shema to your hand was to submit your daily work and your physical energy to the authority of God. The space between the eyes represented human attention. It governed your vision, your desires, and the lens through which you perceived reality.